I recognized that when the hurricane happened on St. Martin, I heard a mantra that I heard on all other islands. The mantra was give thanks. Dona gracia. Give thanks was all over. And they were saying, give thanks for life. And slowly, once I understood that, then I could have conversations with people who explained to me that in their worldview, life is a gift. That's why when they meet each other, they say, give thanks. Give thanks for life. Of course, in trying to understand that, I then had to understand what was behind that. So I came to the understanding, which we will discuss today, the understanding that persons told me a person makes their life, agency, they make it in a family or in a community or in an organization. But they are not the only ones that are making life. There's all kinds of physiological processes that are taking place. And that's being orchestrated, according to most people I spoke to on these islands, orchestrated by a metaphysical force, which they called God. Much research on climate change does not take that into consideration, that most people consider life a gift coming from God. Once I understood that, then I understood that people signified hurricanes and the heat as containing forces. So I recognized that climate challenges would have to be the study of what we call natural phenomena, but also what we call supernatural phenomena. Divinities and all these things had to be part of understanding how people were coping with climate challenges. If we did not do so, we would actually be placing our understandings of the universities and placing it there and saying, this is only climate and that not. But that's not what they were saying. They were saying when the trees were being uprooted, they were saying these trees house certain spirits. And if you do not recognize that, it's not only about planting trees, it's about what kind of home will you create for all the different forms of life that exist on these islands or exist in the universe. So I started with language, and from language I went to life, and then I went to labor. Since I only have 3 minutes, I'm not going to tell you all of that. I'm busy writing a book, looking at all these different parts to try to understand it, how people deal with agriculture in relation to all these spirits. But that recurring mantra of giving thanks, I learned that. I recognized how important it was. So therefore, today I want to start by giving thanks to Yaya and Daniela. They're not here, who are my science communicator and the program manager, because it is thanks to them that this program is taking place. They actually did an enormous amount of work, and I and everyone here should be extremely grateful for that. Now, if you look at the question of climate from deep ecology or from Rastafari or from Candomblé, then you will try to find a keynote that thinks also the question of climate change in the most expansive forms. So whilst we were talking, we just mentioned you, Yaya. Yeah. Whilst, whilst we were thinking about it in work package 2, I was reading a book called 1 Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, which was saying you cannot date the question of climate change from only when it changes around the Second World War with the nuclear spikes that you find. You have to think colonialism. You have to recognize that when you had the Middle Passage, much of these lands were uprooted. That too was part of the Anthropocene. So it was thinking the Anthropocene broader and including the geological. So what did we do? I sent a mail to Catherine, and Catherine said, yes, I'll come. Catherine is of the Queen Mary College in London, of London University, probably in short. She is the author of A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None. She's also the author of Geologic Life. And what I like about her is that whilst we say the distinction nature-culture is problematic. Catherine says, but there's another problematic conception. It is the distinction between bios and geos. It's not only socios and bios, it's bios, socios, and the geos. So I would like Catherine to come and speak to you because she is a professor of inhuman geographies, which actually looks at these perspectives. So Catherine, please. And that's my minutes.
Thank you so much, thank you. And yeah, that was an email that I was really delighted to receive. So I come here very much as someone that's not from here, and it is my first time in the Caribbean. And I'm really looking forward to learning from you all. And I hope that I was kind of, as a geographer, it's sometimes difficult to think about translation between places. So I was kind of thinking about what I could offer in terms of thinking. So what I'm going to do is just sort of talk about one of the things that we do have in common, which is coloniality, colonialism, and the kind of environments of colonialism. We're all differently situated in colonial afterlives. And as we know, Caribbean geographies are distinctly shaped by their European colonial histories, not least in getting here via those colonial centres. So what I wanted to think about was this question with you. It's the area that I sort of reasonably new to me in thinking about inhuman reparations. So taking the question of reparations and kind of placing it in its histories of both the inhumane geographies of colonialism and the inhuman as a kind of category that functions within those kind of colonial epistemologies, and putting that in conversation with Caribbean new imperialisms, not imperialism, sorry, materialisms. There's a slip of the, what I see as the kind of decolonial movement of poets and politicians to really think through this question of materiality in conjunction with what it means to birth a new subject through independence. So part of this is also to think, where did the dream of independence go, and what do these questions of sovereignty mean under climate change? So, as Frankia just said, I understand climate change through the lens of colonialism, and specifically colonial practices of geology, which established a set of geologics around materiality, extraction, and racializing narratives. So, in short, this work sought to show how colonial discourse and practices of genocide transform both subjects and matter into worlds of bios and geos. And they made race as this connective tissue that held together the fiction of separation. So you can't, in fact, separate bios and geos, but race became a sort of interregnum of that, those forms of separation in colonial epistemologies. So the approach to geos as both matter and persons under enslavement was extraction. The racialized worlds of those that were extracted from, so black and brown and colonized peoples of the world, and expanding colonial geographies of extraction too, so European settler colonial countries. So we can think of extraction as a colonial life force, a habitus, a genre of being human in its Western patriarchal form, as Sylvia Wynter has instructed us. So it's a way of making power, geopower, as the central weapon in the defense of that colonial life form and its asymmetrical power geographies, what we might now call racial capitalism. So extraction is material, is psychic, is geophysical. It defines trajectories of power and the cost of that power for those that work and live in its shadow geologies next to the tailing dams, in the atmospheres of refineries, in receipt of the force of the hurricane, in the toxic afterlives of colonial geologies. So tying together the metaphoric and epistemologies of geology and geography, along with the materialities of of geology, the Martinique poet Edouard Glissant remarked, "The first colonist, Christopher Columbus, did not voyage in the name of a country, but in the name of an idea. The idea of finding the Indies and its fantasized wealth was so powerful to Columbus and the structures that produced him that he simply named the islands that he sailed into the West Indies. So the root of the idea was mineralogical. It was extractive. It was an idea of gold. The gravity of that idea of extraction pulled Columbus around the globe. It was a geophysics of sense that was achieved through what Glissant called, quote, a debasement more eternal than apocalypse, end quote. So where fungibility of the enslaved was made in the commodity and symbolic form of the inhuman, in the dream of gold. These historical geologic grammars participated in making black and brown life through the concomitant material geographies of extraction and the calculus of hierarchies of racial value. So the question for decolonial poets and politicians, as they were often both politicians and poets of the Caribbean, was how to enact repair to this twinned colonial geography of extraction and subjugation. The question that was asked in the Caribbean, in the islands of Indonesia, in Cape Verde, in Africa, ties together an empirics of extraction, or what we might call kind of questions of the environment, with epistemes of materiality. So the ideas, the images, the imaginations of what matter is, and the relationship between subjectivity and matter. So climate change represents an inverted asymmetrical geography of contribution of greenhouse gases and accumulation of climate impacts. This wealth inversion assumes a geography shaped by racial geophysics, insomuch as it maps broadly onto the contour of racialized and poor populations, often peoples whose lives and geographies have been severely disrupted and malnourished due to colonialism. So it's a accumulating vulnerability. Broadly, cumulative emissions map onto colonial and settled colonial states. So it's not simply that colonialism disrupted environments to produce our current climate crisis and its amplification of those historic vulnerabilities, but that concomitantly it disrupted environmental knowledges. So it's this tying together of both a sort of disruption of environment and environmental knowledges that informed and made sovereignty possible, which is to say the environmental and the epistemic are entangled, and both are involved in questions in freedom and autonomy. Decolonial fighters and politicians across European empires understood well that there is no political subjectivity without environmental autonomy, such as those like Amilcar Cabral were painfully aware of hunger and famine that those environmental monocultures of European plantations brought with them. They also understood that the environment was a site of struggle for political independence, where knowledge of the environment mattered for political insurgency, and the necessity of engaging the vernacular ecologies that structured reciprocal relations of becoming a subject with the earth, animals, weather, food. You can't kind of campaign for a politics if you can't eat. So, co-creation of futures under climate change requires a reanimation of histories that were cut off by colonialism and continue to endure flattening in neo-colonial times. If extraction is the monolingualism, to get back to the question of language, of materiality, a version of colonial geology that practices thingification of metals, minerals, and historically peoples, the epistemic decolonization of these terms, tactics, and imaginaries of the environment, which are deployed in governance models of environmental politics and policy, requires attention to the kind of density of that language. Natural resources are the normative Western relation to materiality that encompass land, sea, and country in the form of property and access to like these kind of properties of life that are sort of denoted to matter for subjectivity. The grammar of geology is the syntax of that monolingualism of materiality, as the plantation is the monoculture of soil and the mine the mono-extraction of the deep and subsurface. So a new kind of geopolitics is needed that understands states of geophysical being. So really thinking about the subject as a geophysical being that is embodied in structures of language with materiality. And this might replace a political account of the subject as biopolitically bordered and understood and help us understand the role of the earth in making forms of life. So forms of life that are indivisible from a racialized account of the inhuman, or the inhuman as a medium of racial effects and narratives. So I want to start with what seems like a simple question, and that is, where and how do reparations take place? So how do they take place? If place is understood as a constitutive dimension of being and becoming a political subject that differentiates itself from designations of subjectivity under colonialism. So how does the earth collaborate in decolonial acts? If it's been weaponized via the kind of long life of colonialism, how can it be retooled as a medium of liberation and living? How are diasporic geographies and environments and mineralogical cosmologies involved in the question of reparations? So colonialism is an environmental or geophysical event as much as it is a political geography, one that's been fractured through racialized geologic formations, such as the mine, the plantation, and climate change now. And thus the arrangements of materialities, materialisms, and matter are all implicated in political sovereignty and colonial debt relations. So, in what kind of epistemic and environmental space does justice land? So, justice doesn't land in a vacuum. The Trinidadian and Canadian poet Dion Brand's collection, Land to Light On, she holds in her poems and prose the question of diasporic landing, the search for a landing that allows the journey to be spoken, a search and a wandering that refuses the binds of territory and the patriarchal nation state. Landing is a subjective act, not necessarily a confirmation, but a reciprocity to the density of geographies held and the ability to endure in that holding of geography. And she says, I am giving up on land to light on. You see it without its history of harm, without its damage, or everywhere you walk on earth, there is harm, everywhere resounds. This is the only way you will know the names of cities, not charmed or overwhelmed. All you see is museums of harm and metros full in Paris, walls inspected crudely for dates, and Amsterdam, street corners full of druggists, ashen with it, all the way from Suriname, Curaçao, Dutch and German inking on their lips, pen nips of harm, blued in the mouth, not to say London squares, blackened in statues. I can't get out and kiss the ground. So she's refusing there the question of landing in this kind of colonial state, which is to say that tying the inhuman and reparation together means that they might undo one another in the acceptance of an easy notion of repair, when repair is not understood in relation to what it is kind of repairing in terms of environments. So who's the subject of inhuman reparations in law? What is the environment of restitution? In legal contexts, the inhuman refers to dehumanizing or degrading treatment of subjects as a violation of human rights. The right against inhumane acts is designated under Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and more generally, it's kind of peppered through the language of the legal system. But the discursive antagonism of the inhuman makes it an unlikely contender, perhaps, as a site of spatial subjective innovation in law. And yet, if we remember these subjective histories of the inhuman as a site of conflicted occupation of both the objectification of subjects and the earth alike, the most extreme form, which is the status of the slave as inhuman property, then the inhuman offers a combined path in critical legal theory to both address the sedimented racialized histories of the human and to attend to this deadly segregation of the human from its material and environmental world, and especially the violent acts of this discursive kind of material apartheid against indigenous and diasporic peoples. And we've particularly sort of seen this now in the resurgence of ethno-nationalism that really kind of confirms the boundaries of the nation state around a particular ethnic model of being human. So furthermore, the inhuman gives a more precise historic purchase on the epistemic categorizations, so the kind of accumulation of categorizations that have got us to this current Earth condition, which the term environment is, doesn't allow in so much it is kind of vague and all-encompassing, and it's historically unlocated. So attending to this double life of the inhuman as subject to matter is a way to understand the historical forces of inhumane and inhuman power relations that organize through geologic extraction and the kind of concomitant environmental and social destruction that accompanies extraction, and to address the colonial modes of classification that underpin this geopower and its transformation of personhood and the planetary. So it's kind of coupling these things together, but also remembering their histories. The inhuman offers a way to move beyond a metaphysics of the subject that configures hierarchical and racialized genres of the human. Climate crisis and environmental change are enacting inhumane conditions on human and non-humans alike, albeit with highly differentiated impacts and intensities. Thus, the political train of the human as a form of life that is fractured by material manifestations of planetary changes is fostering the need for a new idea of the human subject that is a subject that must fight for environmental rights in order to allow the possibility of human rights. So we're now kind of in this sort of situation where human rights are entirely dependent on environmental rights, and yet these two are still separated in the kind of spaces of law. So there's four reasons that I see to engage within human reparations. Firstly, to decenter the human as an exclusive category of life, so a kind of privileged form of bios that fails to recognize other forms of life and the earth, geos. And of course, I'm drawing on here on Sylvia Wynter's kind of idea of man as the social reproduction of the human and personhood in general, and adding this kind of like division with geos into the mix. So second, to give an account of subjectivity as a geophysical entity. So thinking about subjects as geophysical entities participating in geophysical forces, embedded in collective geoforces and subjugated by the politics of geopower and forms of extraction. And thirdly, we might mobilize the inhuman as a bridge towards reconciliation between the political theory of the human and the actuality of the earth that counters the legal fiction of the human as materially autonomous from earth conditions. So in short, the earth is the only non-negotiable entity. And climate change, in effect, signals a profound meeting between natural and Western law and its kind of divisions and apartheids. So four, to make a cautious case for inhuman reparations as a basis of beginning to address the disassociation of bios from geos, as a denial of a relation and relational forms of life subtended by inhuman earth and Western thought. So the twinned expansion of imperial and colonial geographies ushered in a regime of property rights of things for colonizers, understood as entities that span the continental spatial scale from terra nullius, so the property of an empty earth, to enslavement of people who became codified under the mark of the slave. And this expansion was made possible empirically and epistemically through the medium Earth. So it's the very kind of geopower in the annexation of land and extraction of geology that allows these forms of classification to kind of calcify. So crucial to the functioning of these racialized geologics was the forgetting, both empirically and epistemically, of the actual material ground that actualizes and sustains subjectivity, alongside the activation of an internal set of racial divisions that suture forgetting into a different classificatory order. So, in this formation, in human space, or geos, is an area of governance for the human bios, enacted through extraction and governed through race. So, race is the thing that holds these things together as a governing form. Historically included in geos was indigenous and enslaved peoples. And in this primary equation that moves from geos to bios, the claim of the human and the kind of Western colonial human is to reverse that ordering. So to reverse it to bios geos. So life is understood as a space of kind of political action, of ordering of the geos. And we're at this moment now where that friction is starting to kind of turn back, and the reminders every day that geos is in fact the very kind of context in which the sort of biopolitical subject is given life and autonomy. But the suture stands in place of the cut that can be made in this kind of fiction from geos. So this is why race can always be called upon as a marker of difference that can function internally and externally to designate rights to property. So this kind of way in which race is folded into a conceptualization of property and properties via the kind of thingification of colonial organizations of classifications. So alongside the international, national, indigenous arenas of legislative scope, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, announced the legally binding scope of state-based geophysics recently. This was on the July 23rd, and they ruled in favor of reparations payable to states affected by large emitters. So it essentially makes kind of nation states geophysics into a kind of place where demands for reparations could be raised around their geophysical regimes. So while natural laws and the laws of nature have often been kind of placed outside of law as force majeure, a superior force, an act of God, in practice, they're often kind of in proximity to the humans, often through weather derivatives, through storm insurance, carbon credits more recently. So confronting this legal efficacy of geocide, whereby some humans have weaponized the medium of Earth against other humans and almost all species, a case might be brought for the emergence of a diverse field of inhuman reparations, where inhuman reparations are understood as the geologic restitution necessary to allow a subject that is of a geology of the earth, of the land, to come into being in both the kind of present, future, anterior, and past sedimentation of ancestors or extinctions. So not being constrained by the colonial renditions of temporality and subject recognition. So we can understand these conjoined spaces of ecocide and genocide that mark colonialism's history as constitutive of an action of geocide, of the kind of taking away of geography of a place to land. So geocide was initiated in a planetary mode through the making landless of indigenous peoples in colonial and settled colonial displacements, and continues in neo-colonial declared and undeclared wars for geopower, enacted at the expense of everything and everybody who stands in the way of that extraction. And through the billions of displacements that are currently underway due to the climate crisis and extractive industries. So to be without land, a place to land, is to be condemned to wander without recognition or belonging, or the subsistence of a tether to the earth kind of experience, most extremely as thirst, hunger, and exile, but also as kind of forms of belonging. So landlessness is a forced inability to accumulate a density and depth of relation through time, through these kind of exilic conditions. So geocide is a process then of deliberately detaching effective relations with the earth through the medium of the environment. It is a violence leveled at humans and non-humans as a collective condition of subjecthood. So, in raising these kind of questions of reparations as a salve to the continued destruction of the context of life, the roots of the future are being sowed. So, reparations is about a payment for the present in the ICJ ruling, but its structural effects is to mobilize a claim on the future as a financial reward, an effective claim to the future as a right. As state-based reparations issued by French and British governments in the context of enslavement, and these were reparations given to enslavers, organized the economies of the future and the renewal of colonial subjects to come through that inheritance. So in the context of those British and French government payouts, the payment was for the loss of their, quote, inhuman property. So harm wasn't reduced, but it was stretched into the present across a genealogy of colonial inheritance, and an inheritance that people are still drawing on now. So the tension between these terms, inhuman and reparation, can open space for possibility, not just ambiguity. The tension between the terms mobilizes a question and a creative space in which things jar, and we have to ask why. The density of indeterminate frictions holds with the restlessness as a constant permutation that stretches between both terms, inhuman and reparations, in ways that make clear that fiction of the kind of separation between bios and geos that holds those entities apart. Repair of the earth must meet the histories of inhumane violence that brought the current geophysical state into being. And as such, the capacity to imagine the future must carry forth this narrative confrontation. So this is why I think it's a kind of productive term to think with. So I think these environmental dimensions of decolonization were very clear to independence movements, and they understood the shared form of degradation between a sense of a kind of psychic sense of the subject and the landscape. So Wright, the Aboriginal author Alexis Wright, calls this the sovereignty of the imagination. So thinking about sovereignty both in its political, environmental, and imaginative terms is an ability to imagine a world otherwise outside of settler narratives and temporalities. So this kind of, the sovereignty of the imagination is also a kind of epistemic organization of how we language this space. So Wright comments that culture is key to this sovereignty of the imagination in the sharedness of the world with its increasing trajectory towards landlessness. Taking time within human as earth and distributed subjectivity with a history of bad relations and occupations that need repair is how to bring back life from the dead law of property, where another kind of geos can assert its power as another form of geopower. So what is the geopower on the dance floor? Hopefully we're going to hear some about later, and in the music and drums and so on. So what other kinds of forms of geopower can we mobilize in order to kind of bring sovereignty into being? So as the climate crisis issues its demands, observed in the crashing impact of natural law into the unnatural, or what we might call white law, that treats the earth as an externality, the colonial clock is continuing to go tick-tock, tick-tock. So we're still on the kind of temporality of that colonial clock that is kind of enrolling subjects into a deadly endgame of division. Will they mourners on the front line, asked Barbados Prime Minister Maya Motley in her speech at the summit, the UN Summit of Climate Change Conference. The epistemic and environmental are conditions of stratification, from the dank submission of relations in extractive languages of matter to the elite capture of geopower. So what I'm trying to say here is that every imagination of the earth brings an ideation of an ideal environmental subject, particularly in terms of policy and climate change policy. But it also brings into being a forgetting of the material processes that brought us here and that kind of distribution of value. So I just want to finish off with thinking about how Caribbean new materialisms, and actually this is Amilcar Cabral and the sort of expanded African diaspora, really thought about these questions about the poetic and political in their geophilosophies that emerge from a kind of trying to make a reparative framework for new political kind of systems. So, which is also to say that the grit and grind of being intimate with the earth is not all about imposition. So, it's not just about being subjected to geopower, but to the forms in which kind of geopower can become the site of a kind of congregation of political subjectivity. So the historic modes of production of racial capital are always in tension with what they resist, subsume, and attempt to erase. In the abyss of erasure, Glisson puts remembrance in the, quote, rocks dug out of time. In his novel, The Overseer's Cabin, he weaves together one woman's knotted stories of Martinique's histories, incepted by the arrival of colonial violence and our fighting against the black holes of time and forgetting. The Earth archive that Glisson imagines is not metaphoric. It is just that, an archive of Earth's stories, grounded in inhuman intimacies, pushed into the hard minerality of the world as a site of witnessing and repair. As he states, it is the world put into the earth you're turning over. Glisson calls the last chapter of his book the rock of opacity. The dead inhabit the rock. Neither is it dead matter, nor is it gone. Extraction is not the end or the beginning of the story. He quote, Patris Salat inside the rock, Ondu Salat. They are going back along the trace of time before. It is to make it clear for us to light it. So this trace of time before refers to the all too painful roots of history that have made the present possible, and everything that was lost to the vicissitudes of these inhuman journeys. Glisson argues that Martinique's history begins with its geotrauma. It is no longer the past, it's not another past that this trauma, there is no other past than this trauma that is geographic, is geologic, is psychic. The indigenous peoples were exterminated by the enslavers. Everything begins and with this trauma in the coming of those ships, he says. Remembering requires a medium that is as strong and as hard and holds fast like a rock. The rock hides its duration in plain sight. It is the opacity of deep time and its redress, a materiality that will stand up to erasure and forgetting and not be reduced to the imperative to make transparent. And the reason I put this up here, because I think it really shows, Glisson's master's supervisor was Gachon Bachelard. And Bachelard writes this kind of really important book in geography and about the poetics of space. And his student, Glisson, writes a book called The Poetics of Relation. And you can see here how those kind of Caribbean kind of readdressing of the colonial imagination of space and being. So the kind of the poetics of space as a kind of empty container is replaced by the poetics of relation. And there's very direct kind of engagement with the sort of, the French literary capital, but also kind of with his supervisor, which I really like. So maybe I'll end it there. And just to say that, geology, while is a kind of state of kind of the medium of power, it's also a doorway to a different liberation and a way through to a bigger imagination of the world. Thank you.
That was powerful, Catherine. Thank you. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about this. I'm going to now turn to a postdoctoral researcher in Islanders at the Helm. When I said language, life, and labor, this person said to me, but language is communication, Francio. And as he was saying this, someone as we were talking, said, awo. And as they said, awo, I turned, and the awo is the now, but the awo also has a sonic resonance. It changes time. It's not the regular time. We stop, and then something else, then we have time to think. And as that person said the awo, I had to look at Gregory and I said, okay, tell me how you will now include the question of popular music to think through the matters of climate change. So I'd like to call Gregory Richardson to give his presentation on musicality and climate. Thanks.
That's yeah. Yeah, I'll have to read it from All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. And of course, it's a pleasure to be here at the University of Curaçao. Dr. Moises da Costa Gomes. We have to say it the proper way. And thank you for the wonderful introduction as well, Francio. As you already mentioned, my name is Gregory Richardson. I'm from the Instituto Pedagógico Arubano from the Teachers Training College in Aruba. And I am a postdoc researcher in this program. So allow me to take you on a journey on the three different islands on Aruba, Curaçao, and Bonaire through the following lens. So climate change and harvest celebrations in the Dutch Caribbean. Context. So this presentation is grounded in the framework of the Islanders at the Helm initiative, which is a research collaboration centered at agency of small island people in navigating the challenges, climate change, and cultural resilience and sustainable futures. So the project emphasizes the Caribbean islanders are not passive victims of global environment shifts, but active helmsmen, so Capitán di Barco, actually in this process. So I think this is very important that we understand the context. I am not seeing my presentation on the screen, and that's why I think perhaps maybe I can see it from the back. I don't know. So a note on methodology. This research actually is carried out from a reflexive approach. So for me, it's very important that in the process of doing research, you as an anthropologist, as an ethnographer, it's very important that you also are reflective in that process in whatever setting you're in, whatever environment you're in. So that means basically that you always question yourself, you question what you're looking at, what you're observing, and that is extremely important in that process. So we're looking at drawing from anthropology, ethnomusicology, performance studies, and environmental humanities. I combined participant observations, ethnographic field notes, and dialogues with cultural practitioners, musicians, and festival organizers across Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao. And this work is still ongoing. So what is central to this query? I'll start. Solo no lo brilla, agua no lo cae, viento no lo sopla, mano si sempre te. Viento no lo sopla, mano si sempre te. This chant, from a song by Ernesto Rosenthal and Etty Toppenberg, echoed through the towering speakers of a big music truck during the 2023 Carnival Parade in Aruba. The band, Youth Extreme, ironically composed mostly of 40-something-year-olds, played an upbeat jambak soca rhythm while the crowd moved as one. As an uncharacteristic ring straightened the day, the band called on the revelers to raise their hands, chanting, "It's raining, no wiper, the driver can't see, no umbrella, no stamuha. Put your hand in the front and do the wiper." So for those who live in the Caribbean, weather has always been more than meteorology. It's a rhythm, metaphor, and memory. As soca chants blend with ancestral harvest songs, the interplay between climate and culture reveals itself as a living archive, adapting, resisting, and transforming under the weight of global warming. Any serious study of climate here must engage with its cultural manifestations, the rituals, festivals, and performances that embody both vulnerability and resilience. So the central question guiding this essay or this paper is, or this presentation rather, what can we learn from how harvest celebrations on the ABC Islands engage with climate challenges? This involves examining how cultural expressions and environmental change intersect, and how these traditions model adaptation and resilience on both a local and a global level. Kibauta caliente, yente. Kibauta caliente. Así no es. So it's very, very hot down there. So the consequences of global challenges, climate challenges on the islands are very present. The literature has shown this, and this includes environmental levels, meaning rising temperatures, drought, coastal erosion, loss of mangroves, etc. Let me just turn here so I can see it a bit better. Heat, stress, wildfires, coral decline, intensifying hurricanes and erratic rainfall, and threats to agriculture on an economic and social level. Of course, affecting tourism, extreme heat, of course, and infrastructure damage, displacement, migration, and of course, public health stressors for young and old and all generations, and cultural and emotional. That being, for example, festival disrupted by heat or storms, as in our region, shifting times and locations of our rituals, and loss of cultural landscapes and continuity. Umbista, Ribaderagai, Seu e Simadan. E lo qual mita sinti, mira, tende, wak, e hole. So for those of Curaçao, I'm writing it in the etymological spelling, the Aruban spelling, but you can follow it. The heat was overwhelming. A sweltering, enveloping heat that made colors brighter and sounds sharper. Costumes were precise, every fold and every ribbon carefully placed. Yet beneath the formality pulsed rhythm, confidence, flair, and understated defiance. Among the marchers were farmers and professionals, politicians and performers, and even a priest. Moving to the same rhythm, the heartbeat of the Seu. Mostly women dressed to perfection, grandmothers and granddaughters and daughters, and a few pachis sprinkled in between, some older gentlemen. The air vibrated with tambour-inspired rhythms, the chapi, and the blare of the cachu, following instructions from the cantador mayor. Musicians played as if entranced, their energy driven by powerful female voices, especially on music trucks, leading the call. Among the marchers were also presented watermills, molinas, recalling the old Kunuku windmills once used to draw water from deep wells. Alongside them, small makeshift houses, wooden replicas of modern farm dwellings, appeared on floats or carried by children. These evoked Curaçao's agrarian memory, the rhythm of self-sufficiency, ingenuity of survival in an arid land. Amid the music trucks and polished instruments, these icons whispered of endurance, reminders that tradition, like the wind, continues to turn. As the parade wound through Otra Banda and the heat became one fusing body and landscape, the sound deepened, the chants intensified, and the line between performer and spectator dissolved. When the procession reached its final stretch, all was movement, song, color, dust, and bodies in unison. Then abruptly silence. The music faded, the crowd dispersed. After we passed Rodeweg and we entered the end, everyone disappeared. Then abruptly, then like memory, Seoul revealed itself not as a relic, but as an ongoing negotiation between containment and release, decorum and desire, endurance and joy. I moved to Aruba now. Driving later towards Santa Cruz and Gochi, where the main Deragai celebration takes place, smoke rose from the horizon. Great bonfires filling the night sky as they approach, drums beat and the voices sang. Sawanta bing, sawanta bai. Deregai, pero no wate, etc. I moved to Bonaire. In Rincon, houses were decorated with stalks of maishi, a golden thread linking past and present. The heat too was there, relentless. Yet the atmosphere exuberant. Visitors from Aruba and Curaçao mingled with the locals. The aromas of stobaca brito, sopi yuana, and fried fish filled the atmosphere. Children marched proudly with their own small bands and were wapaying, circled through dust and song, slow, deliberate, and joyous. Everywhere community was palpable, culture and heritage stood in full display, cameras rolling, voices chanting, laughter rising. From the Seu fire in Curaçao, to the fire and to the bonfire in Aruba with the Deragai and the Simadan processions in Bonaire, these were not simple performances. They were acts of belonging, expressions of continuity. Even amid drought, heat, uncertainty, the people of the ABC Islands danced their history into present. So a few observations. Deragai is usually held around June 24th. So meaning bury the rooster literally. The bonfires or the fires is representing purification and renewal. Fiesta de San Juan, of course, is celebrated not only on Aruba, but it's also celebrated on the other islands as well and throughout the region. But every island, of course, has its own unique touch to it, has its own unique touch. Of course, the yellow and the red are very present in the attire. The music, of course, is tambour and the different instruments they use. So the symbolism, of course, is of death and rebirth as we burn and we fertilize, and gratitude and continuity, and especially, of course, agriculture, Thanksgiving. Simadan, celebrated during harvest. Central event, of course, Dia de Rincon, but it's not only tied to Rincon. Of course, it's a prayer of thanksgiving, and it's very similar to what you see on the other islands. The unique dance, the wapa, communal rhythm and cooperation, call and response, and this is also an example of what I've been presenting to you this morning. Very important, very embedded in let's say, in Afro-derived traditions. And again, also embodying gratitude and being thankful. And we see the same with Curaçao. Held on Easter Monday, it's organized both in town or in Willemstad and also in Bandabao. Originally, it's a greeting, a blessing. The roots and plantation life from the kunuku to the magazina, which is the storage room. Costumes, earth tones, yellow, reds, etc. Also very thankful for the many blessings. And of course, it's not a season, let's say it's a season of activities, which includes also different festivals and songs, competitions, and so forth. So it's much broader. These are just some of the highlights. So, kaya tapapia. So for those who don't know, that is the word on the street. What is the T? Of course, we present in one aspect of the harvest festivals. So when I began this journey, I expected a clear, direct link between climate change and agriculture. Complaints about the heat, calls for water conservation, and overt appeals for sustainability. While these themes exist, so that's where my aha moment came, and I found it very important to share with you. The reality proved to be more complex. This was not something everyday people were talking about besides a few experts and academics. The connection between harvest celebrations and climate emerges more clearly in how people adapt their presentation. Older and younger bodies negotiating the space, organizing shifting hours, communities balancing tradition, spectacle, and care. So what is the word on the street? You can raise your hand or agree or disagree with me if you have heard these before. I'm going to read some of them. Some of the critics would say, e cosecha ko botawak ay ding marcha nota di ningong plantasyong ta di centrum nga cumpre. Centrum is a supermarket here in Curaçao. Have you ever heard that? Yeah. Another one. Ta gewoon outro tipo de carnaval ita. You heard that also? Some of the critics. Cara yung makeup e color ng di paña nota klop. So the face is full of makeup and the colors are not the traditional colors of the Seua de Simpna. Ting grupo ta exclusivo, nang ta discrimina. So this is what I've been hearing on the street. So some groups are very exclusive. Not everyone is allowed to participate in. You would hear that mostly in Carnival, but you also hear it more frequently in the marcha as well for Seua. Maybe hindi ta bing pa bebeso. Nanta kima sushi tur caminda, ita crea molester. So you can see the translation below. And another danos cultura, noting nada de tradition. So it doesn't have anything to do with tradition. So that's the word on the street. Oh, no. So, my goodness. Yeah. So, as I go towards the end. So, these critiques are often spoken with irony, frustration, or affection to reveal the tension between authenticity and transformation. For some, the harvest parades have become spectacles detached from the land. For others, they remain living traditions that adapt and endure. Yet walking and observing in Marchena, Bandabao, Rodeweg, Rincon, Savaneta, and Santa Cruz, I came to realize that much of what is presented to a certain degree is symbolic, yet it is much more complex than that. Even amid drought and scarcity, organizers encourage food security, awareness, and a sense of connection to the land. But for many participants, the primary impulse is to celebrate, to express, to make meaning. And that meaning making is in itself a form of resilience. So, to finalize, Kiko fiesta de cosecha riba isla de ABC por anos de cambio climatológico. So, how or what can harvest festivals teach us about climate change? The findings suggest that climate resilience of small island societies cannot be understood solely through infrastructure, economics, or policy. Resilience is lived through culture, rhythm, ritual, memory, and collective creativity. Cultural adaptation, embodied knowledge, and creative reinvention show that resilience is both practical and poetic. The harvest celebrations of Seu, Simadan, and Deragay teach us what it means to live, create, and endure amid climatic uncertainty. Through intergenerational continuity, reinvention, and creative merging of music and symbolism, especially through the older generation and the younger generation, you see it very strong, as in younger people creating their own bands under the leadership, under the guideship of the older ones. You see that continuation. And the young people really love it. They're all into it. A choreography of endurance where beauty and resilience coexist. They remind the world that climate resilience is not only scientific or technical, but profoundly human, rooted in creativity, faith, and collective imagination of people who refuse to let sun, rain, and wind determine their joy. As I mentioned in the beginning, as I sang in the beginning. And this is my last slide, Francio. Okay, so what we did, I took you on a journey through my ethnographic experience, my observations through the process. So I started off with the idea of, hey, there's this obvious link between climate challenges and harvest festivals, but I noticed I found it to be different, and it was very interesting as well, and very beautiful to see. So, vamos ao futuro. Let's look at the future. So as sea levels rise and temperatures climb, the harvest festivals on the ABC Islands face an uncertain but imaginative future. The question is not whether Seu, Simadan, and Deragay will survive, but how they will transform. So I just playing around now with the future. Harvest festivals, how might they look like in the future? At night, we already have lighting parades and different festivals in the evening. Even Deragay is actually celebrated at night. Harvest festivals on boats or on the sea. Indoor harvest festivals. I don't know how good that is for the climate. Harvest festivals transplanted elsewhere in the diaspora, for example, it's becoming even more popular. Every year I'm seeing more and more harvest festivals in the Netherlands and so forth. And new style harvest festivals created in cooperation with other artistic and cultural practices. So with that, mashadanki.
Whoa.
Oh.
Very nice. Yeah. Very nice. We are now going to take a brief break, and then we'll come back and we will get the last presentation, and then all the questions you have in your minds or in your hearts, then you will be able to express yourself. So let's take a break. There's drinks outside, right? 15 minutes break. Thanks. Yeah. Stopped. Is anyone outside? No, right? No one is outside, right? Aga. Okay. Shut us off. Okay. We are now going to the last presentation before we have the panel discussion. And this is a postdoctoral fellow in Islanders at the Helm, who I've learned a whole lot about, because to me, the importance of the work of Charissa Granger, who's at the University of the West Indies, the campus, St. Augustine campus in Trinidad and Tobago. But what I learned from her really is that she said, if we want to come to terms with the climate challenges, we will have to think again. That means ideas of nationalism we'll have to let go of. We'll have to think something else. Belonging we'll have to let go of. We'll have to think something else. And as I always hear her speak, I have to think about the dance hall tune called Broke Out. And that's really leaving the chorale completely and thinking anew. So I'd like to hear Charissa Granger inform us with her ceremonies of being, Caribbean music, poetics, and the philosophy for climate futures. So Charissa, let's leave the nation alone.
Good morning, buen dia. With gratitude and heartfelt thanks, I want to honor the work of Daniela Britt and Yaya Seekers, keepers of the cadence with efficiency that looks like grace, constancy that feels like belonging, and the unseen labor that opened the doors for us today and stitched this room together. My ideas today are gathered under the title Ceremonies of Being, Caribbean Music, Poetics, and Philosophy for Climate Futures. And I begin with a quote. Human beings are magical, bios and logos, words made flesh, muscle and bone, animated by hope and desire. Belief materialized in deeds, deeds which crystallize and are actualities. And the maps of spring always have to be redrawn again in undared forms. Sylvia Winter. Together with this, I would like to play a clip. We found ourselves in a swinging cadence rampa at Nowhere Special, St. Maarten in 2022. The rhythmic steel guitar locked with the drums and the cymbals, creating a cadence rhythm, and the room thickened into what Ben Anderson names an affective atmosphere, a singular charge that emanates from, envelops, yet exceeds the assembling bodies, perpetually forming and deforming with each arrival, laugh, and sway. In Sylvia Winter's sense, that thickening was the threshold of ceremony for me, not mere entertainment, but a praxis where bodies, sounds, and relation rescript sociality and being, where a once more human world is rehearsed in groove and breath. Islanders researchers were summoned to leave just as things were heating up. I wanted to stay, to feel the poetics of the place, and having to leave, we re-entered institutional time and missed attending to ceremony itself, where climate, culture, and human might have been briefly remade in common time. Such ceremony is often excluded from thought, especially as incantation of invasive species, native species, born here, biological, endemic, indigenous are sounded out. I collect these words like sharp-edged shells from the shore of my field notes. Each term purports to classify life into neat categories of belonging and unbelonging, cutting the tongue and the ear with colonial inheritances. I hear invasive used for more than lionfish or goats. It slides towards people, Haitians, Dominicans, Venezuelans, the Dutch, a bestiary of otherness where flora, fauna, and folk blur. Native and born here become badges as if lineage were a license to speak, as if arrival dates decide who truly belongs, taxpayer versus non-taxpayer, another border deciding who deserves and who drains. Where you from? Who you for? Questions sung as passports granting legitimacy or withholding it. Even indigenous becomes contested terrain. I hear of people and knowledge described as indigenous or indigenized, but only when in self-reflexivity, indigenous becomes too confining and the speakers end up excluding themselves in their essentialism. Then I hear indigenizing, suggesting a process towards becoming that is never quite complete. Meanwhile, indigenous knowledge is often cast as an alternative to colonial science, as if wisdom itself must choose a side. Even in anti-colonial discourse, this binary can creep in, unsettling me with its echo of the very divisions we seek to undo. Resilience. I learned that this word wears different faces in archaeology and in cultural studies. In climate science, it is a virtue, a bounce back, rebuild, to endure. But I have also seen how the praise of resilience can mask the forces that made resilience necessary. Whose resilience and at what cost? Who is called on to be resilient? The power relations that demand some to be resilient prompt in me deep unease as it is mentioned in climate research and discourse. The heroic ring of the term falters when I hear in its echo the unspoken expectation that certain communities must always tough it out. It dwells uncritically in so many funded research projects building resilient communities. Each of these terms is more than just a word. In isolation, each might seem technical or benign, but together they form a discursive formation, an assemblage of myths and ideologies, a regulated way of speaking about climate and culture that shapes the solutions we imagine and work towards. In Dutch Caribbean climate projects, in activist meetings, in scholarly work, even in my own ethnographic conversations, these words set the stage. They tell a story about who belongs and who disrupts, whose knowledge counts and whose is marginal. They feed into policies and politics, seeping into well-intentioned anti-colonial efforts. Our colleague Lizanne Charles says, "We ain't going nowhere fast." Shared from her ethnography, perhaps not fast, but definitely somewhere, because there are ceremonies of and for being. I want to go into how living is made to be an art form, poesis and autopoiesis, to underscore the ceremonies that make this possible. To unsettled, I sift through these inheritances and their vocabularies that trouble my tongue. This critique is my prelude, an opening act of refusal and an invitation to think otherwise, especially with Caribbean philosophies, poetics, and music. If the language of climate crisis is tangled up in colonial categories and logics, I look instead to the vernacular of lived experience, towards music and collective creativity for other ways of knowing. I've been asked how and why this relates to climate, environment, mitigation, climate crisis, told that my area of inquiry needs to relate more strongly to climate change. But the intentional commitment to not understand climate events and challenges as not only a material emergency of rising seas and coastal erosion and collapsing reefs, but also an epistemic and ontological one, encourages me to move as I have during my research in this project. The categories we inherit are not neutral descriptors, and the research focus that we are awarded funding for and attention that we give to it are not either. They are colonial residues that dictate whose life and knowledge counts and whose survival is prioritized and what that survival looks like. Climate research, if it relies only on technocratic and biological terms, risks reproducing these very hierarchies under the guise of sustainable development and rebuilding resilient communities. By interrogating the language itself, the discursive formations that underwrite policies, research agendas, and even community activism, we open up the possibility of seeing climate, environments, and aftermaths differently, and thereby imagining Caribbean and planetary futures otherwise. This matters because the way we name, define, and conceptualize determines the way we act and live. This is a world remaking project following some of our eminent philosophers and artists, Wilson Harris, Edward Gleason, Sylvia Wynter, Kama Brathwaite, to name a few, who, if we read them all carefully, would teach us that naming lionfish as invasive authorizes eradication as an action and colonially tinged destruction. They would teach us that naming migrants as illegals authorizes exclusion. Naming matters to life and death, being and non-being. I have also been critiqued during my course in this project for my emphasis on poetics and abstractness of poetic knowledge instead of oriented political action. Yet the colonial categories within which we continue to operate, where in the Dutch Caribbean scholarship, music is scarcely imagined beyond a jingle or a backtrack for a climate awareness campaign, reveal how colonial epistemologies remain rigid, totalizing, and final, even as creative practice persists as an integral part of our sociality. To undo the rigidity then requires a form that refuses closure, refuses neatness. Poetics and poetry are not ornamental. They are methodological. They are ways of thinking and writing that keep meaning porous and allow opacity, that foreground relation over definition. Caribbean musical and cultural practices, calypso, carnival, musicizumbi, string bands, already move in this register. They practice critique not only by argument, but by rhythm, pun, play, and ceremony. To write about them faithfully requires a language that can bend, that can syncopate and exceed the straight lines of technocratic prose, especially for climate research. In other words, climate futures cannot be imagined through data tables alone. They require world-making imaginaries. Poetry is the discipline of that imaginary. It is where relational, affective, and planetary dimensions can be apprehended without being flattened. If climate change is a crisis of imagination, as much as ecology, then poetry is not optional, it is indispensable. Return to what I call ceremonies of being, departing from Sylvia Wynter's work. The ceremony must be found and ceremony found. Intimate gatherings, sonic practices, acts of reworlding that whisper of futures beyond the strictures of native and invasive. In the cadence of calypso, in carnival's chaotic embrace, I hear an alternative lexicon for climate futures. These ceremonies offer a chance to reimagine how to be human on a threatened planet and a geographic location that knows the aftermaths of the threat too intimately. They are my departure point, always away from the buzzwords and that unsettle me, towards a vocabulary as yet uncharted. It invites us to rethink how we come to know ourselves and each other, and critiques the colonial modern frameworks that have historically constrained that knowledge. We missed attending to the ceremony at Nowhere Special, which is indicative of Dutch Caribbean research, where much of our ceremonies are an afterthought. The ceremony must be found, the ceremony found. I snorkeled at Buko Reef, afraid because I cannot swim. I snorkeled in the rain at Cotton Bay and Emerald Bay in Tobago, in Aruba at Mangalhalto and Spance Lagoon. An Aruban marine biologist tied a bodyboard to her ankle and towed me into the seagrass and coral gardens. Their abundance encountered the climate discourse of decay. Corals, if given a chance, can regenerate. There is some damage here, but this life is trying to restore itself, trying to regenerate, said Blair in Tobago and Oriana in Aruba. Just below the surface, I encountered ceremony, a ceremony of being, a counter beauty filled with color, fragility, asking for tenderness, and where transformation becomes thinkable. Strong, massive corals and skittish little fish helped me to find ceremony. Sonic restoration extends the ceremony. Recordings of healthy reefs played at degraded sites draw fish and invertebrates back, jumpstarting coral sediment. Marco Bardotti's, what I call sea coral for coral, pushes this solar-powered 3D printed sculptures that broadcast reef songs to revive habitat. Here, sound is not the core, but an instrument of repair. Creative practice is not mere entertainment or illustrative afterthought. It is an epistemic technology, a way of knowing and making of the world in the wake of colonial modernity and climate crisis. Following Emisizer's sense that poetry is knowledge and Winter's critique of academia, I exceed those critiques by attending to creative practice as liberatory method for climate livability and imagining otherwise. Ceremony is a doing, a heretical rupture that practices being human otherwise. For Winter, the human is not what one is, but what one does. Think here of Juve as exemplar, a practice through which our local concepts of the human can be deinstituted and reincorporated in new ways and more inclusive epistemes. Ceremony remakes what was rendered unwettable and livable relation. It names the autopoetic work, redrawing origin stories and social codes. Think here of the ceremony between Desdemona and Othello, which was a heretical act. Part of ceremony is forging precisely such a correlational science, one in which sonic praxis, choral rehab, and collective feeling are not mere illustrations, but sites of knowledge generation and political imagination. Domino tables in the side streets, beach limes and barbecues at Sandy Ground, comeback Montuno parties and carnival fetes, barbershops, and our laboratories where rhythm, call and response, and improvisation center feeling and attunement, this articulating colonial grammars of race, nation, and purity. Underwater, on land, and in the street, ceremony marks the threshold where bios joins logos and geos, where narrative becomes deed, where sound becomes shelter. Reef soundscapes call fish back home. Juve calls us back to one another. Between them lies a method: listen, feel, gather, compose. Climate work is not only measurement and mitigation, but also the cultivation of ceremonials that make other worlds sensible and therefore possible. Ceremonies found at the edge of non-being. Capitalist infrastructures and ways of being fuel practices of deforestation, the decay of barrier reefs by destructive cruise liners, paths, and intensified coral bleaching due to rising temperatures and pollution, and the vulnerabilities of islands that rely on reefs that buttress the shores against storms, the desertification of land that enables development projects like overwater bungalows and beach bar piers, mass aquaculture and water sports that pollute, mangrove deforestation and eradication of swamplands are generative of flooding caused by ocean surges that kill local fishing villages and economies, land grabbing for more resorts, golf courses and spas, developed by those who can afford citizenship by investment programs that only enrich and benefit local island governments, luxury coastal developments for resorts and Airbnb condos that partly are built on marshland, new ones that stress electric grids, placing islanders in precarity and erode vegetations, which have a function of dancing with the tidal surges, the constant attempt to privatize resources, water, energy, beaches, and appropriate land for real estate investors after natural disasters that exacerbate socioeconomic disparities and further displaces already vulnerable populations. Overcoming the above demands grounding climate debates in radical Caribbean thought that envisions transformed economies, ecologies, and human relations. In practice, this means employing poetics and thought traditions to challenge technocratic extractivist paradigms that imagine climate futures based on freedom, reciprocity, and justice. By bringing embodied creative knowledges into climate research, Caribbean scholars can highlight how joy and collective making, feeling, and action sustain communities in times of ecological peril, pointing towards alternative relational ways of living. These are not isolated injuries, but the choreography of extraction through which capital organizes Caribbean life and land. To overcome the region's coloniality of climate is to refuse the premise that technocratic fixes can mend an ontology built on domination. It is to reimagine economies and ecologies and relation under the sign of freedom and reciprocity. At the heart of the trouble is the overrepresentation of man, a human exceptionalism that partitions human, not quite human, non human, and legitimates the sacrifice of islands to profit. What then are the lives remade in the teeth of the insurmountable? What scholarly lenses miss again and again are the small laboratories of reinvention, panyards, fetes, processions, where music composes relational ethics. What is the imperative that demands a once more human world in which to see reflected the power of creativity? Winter. This once more is not nostalgia, but practice. A playing together, bodies learned another grammar, rhythm, call and response, displays possessive individualism. With mutual attunement, sensation becomes method, feeling becomes form. A lived poetics of relation emerges in which human being is continuously refigured by aesthetic invention, collective joy, and care. If we are to begin to effect a systemic change that our present global order urgently requires, we must first undo the overrepresentation of man and unsettle the coloniality of knowledge that underpins it. This entails a rethinking of the human outside the terms dictated by the Western model of rationality, individualism, and economic utility. This is Sylvia Winter. The task then is epistemic as much as environmental. Unsettling cannot mean the museumization of indigenous knowledge as a decorative proof of inclusion, nor its extraction into syllabi and grants while hierarchies remain intact. It calls for a pluriversal orientation in which knowledges are inseparable from relations, responsibilities, and worlds, and not just add-ons to a Western frame. Ceremonies of being already articulate these other ways of being. They are made in carnival villages and barbershops, on sporting grounds, at family days, at comeback montuno parties and beach limes, And as I said, Sunday cookouts in Sandy Ground, you can see that I really enjoyed those. They are also remade by the dusty domino tables where cumbia, bachata, merengue, vallenato, and salsa ride the evening air in Colby and Dutch Quarter. Ethnography in St. Maarten insisted on this. There is method in the gather, theory in the groove. This insistence entails a critique of our own house. Dutch Caribbean research too often sidelines creative practice, poetics, and performance as illustration rather than inquiry. Precisely the tendency Winter is challenging in the two articles, The Ceremony Must Be Found and Revisited in The Ceremony Found. How in our scholarship is ceremony found, and once found, how is it tended to? The question is about research and disciplinarity and Dutch Caribbean academia. Here, Aaron Kamugisha's charge to Caribbean intellectuals is bracing to draw deeply on the archipelago of Caribbean thought, not merely as a ledger of injury, but as a repertoire for imagining livable futures. To neglect this inheritance is to forfeit our sharpest tools of critique and creation. And secondly, to honor the Caribbean popular as a profound site of freedom making and revolution. Edge conditions, storms, heat, slow violence press the Caribbean towards the brink of non-being. Yet at the edge, ceremonies assemble, not as escape, but as counter-infrastructure. They are studies in reciprocity, in the erotics of relation, in the stubborn refusal of the world as given. To take them seriously is to accept that climate futures will be made not only in laboratories and ministries, but in yards and streets, that livability will depend as much on the education of feeling as on the engineering of seawalls. The wager here is simple and demanding. If we learn from the ceremonies we already practice, we may yet craft a once more human world, attuned to and tuned to the rhythms of reciprocity and the dignity of relation. Such learning will not save us from the weather, but it can change who we are within it, and thus what futures we can bear to imagine and bring together. There is sound, and I have no control of the sound. Maybe it's possible to raise the volume in the PowerPoint presentation itself. Mr. Timer Man, you're gonna pause for me now. Okay, maybe while they sort that, I'll continue. We jamming still. My work argues that Caribbean music, poetics, and philosophy disclose climate not merely as an environmental emergency, but as a crisis of being and relation. Taking Sylvia Wynter's reconceptualization of the human as our pivot, I named some Caribbean sonic and creative cultural practices as ceremonies of being, collective performances in which sensing becomes knowing and knowing becomes world making. In these ceremonies, invention, intimacy, and improvisation are not decorative but diagnostic. They expose the limits of technocratic frames and open an epistemology of relation attuned to planetary entanglement. To feel and to attend to such practices then is to encounter a climate method grounded in poiesis, that is self-making and world-making, in which art is not an illustration of science, but a partner in thinking. Across presentations, readings, workshops, publications, and conferences, I tracked how the sonus poetics, that is, the material intelligence of instruments, the discipline of rhythm, the caesura of the break, works as an education of feeling. The rhythm section instructs in collective timing and consent. The break disarticulates inherited categories so that other socialities might surface. Salvaged irons and calabash and oil barrels teach remaking, reinvention, and repurposing. Such practices enact what Winter calls a move beyond the overrepresented figure of man towards a relational human practice. You could turn it up though. Please listen. Such practices enact what Winter calls a move beyond the overrepresented figure of man towards a relational human praxis, and they offer a vocabulary for climate futures formed in rather than merely about Caribbean life, against the thin rhetoric of resilience, bouncing back into sanctioned precarity. These ceremonies model reinvention, the leap after Fanon that introduces invention into existence and refuses return to the little normal. Politically, the ceremonies of being scaffold livability, they rehearse forms of care, reciprocity, and commoning that exceed the ledger of cost benefit and the grammar of extraction. Their participatory freedom, moving beyond and bid bodies together without erasing differences, figures a counter sovereignty aligned with Winter's call for new genres of a human. Playing Juve in St. Martin, Trinidad, Antigua, and Aruba, various music events, poetry reading, snorkeling, and in conversation with musicians and attending to climate research. I have followed performance, instrument, and sound as a method of research in Dutch Caribbean. I've taken it up as a research praxis of gathering and keeping, attending to what is present. So the work tilts from argument towards an exploration, stopping to sit with the carcasses of cars at the side of the road that are hurricane liabilities blocking oncoming traffic in narrow streets, but that you can't move because they belong to people. I passed them every day for a month and finally asked a friend and colleague, Lisanne Charles, you think they can get any parts from or for this? She responded, they think so, or that they will win the lottery and get the parts to rebuild it, or they don't want to pay the money to have them moved to the dump. And why should they? Them is government problem now. Our community got together, she said, and towed cars like them from their area in a massive cleanup. After that, the police officer came and told them they aren't allowed to do it without permission from the government. The next time, they requested permission and government told them no, them cars belong to people and government have a process they must follow. She shifted to Link. But you notice how many lottery places there are, right? 2 hours prior, I had noted to self about the lottery shacks, so that what I saw as hazardous debris in relation to hurricane preparedness remains. Results and solutions are here thwarted. Here, I was forced to move from strict logic and solution results oriented responses towards an analogy of relation. I noted that there is a whole other world to be attended to, not of unresolved and unsolved, outstanding, knotty problems, but of the relations among ways of being that we know and don't know, and the desperate ways they still fit together. How do you arrive at the ever increasing lottery vendors discussion from abandoned cars that are hurricane liabilities? Questions of research results and solutions perform in a similar way, so that I offer here no results and no solutions. Instead, I offer a reframing, not universally replicable fixes, asking what counts as climate knowledge instead. From that small example of the cars, I learned that solutionism here flattens complexity, framing social and environmental problems as solvable by tidy interventions, policies, toolkits, slogans. Too easy erases the historical, political, and ethical entanglements my research is designed to surface. Such solutions are never neutral. They embed contested values, whose justice and whose culture, and when rushed to deliverables, they naturalize one side's norm. A results first posture also instrumentalizes culture, turning art, poetics, and philosophy into vehicles of messaging and weakening their critical dissenting force. This is not to deny their transgressive capacities. By contrast, I'm wrapping up. By contrast, my method keeps value conflicts visible and felt rather than promise premature remedies. I sharpen problem definitions and conceptual outlines and attend to stories, sounds, reinventions, and world making that wider the imaginative and narrative option space. Let our climate work then proceed in the key these ceremonies teach: relational, improvisory, and exacting. Let research and policy be scored with rests and breaks sufficient to welcome invention. And as we tune ourselves to the world we are making, let us keep winter's wager and lambing's warning close, that the maps of spring must be redrawn again and again in undared forms, and that the scaffolding of the future will rise only where we practice together the arts of being otherwise. Thank you.
This is after nationalism. Please, Catherine, can you join? We have and Gregory, yeah, please. Mr. Richardson. Can I ask someone to carry a microphone? Persons who might want to. Who would like to pose a first question to any of the? There we go.
Thank you so. Hello? I think I can talk.
They need it because of people on YouTube.
Yeah, it's okay. That's working now. Yeah, thank you so much for your presentations. I really, I was amazed by the last one, and I was just thinking about how, there are Caribbean technologies of heating up and cooling down. Like you talked about Carnival, and I was thinking how Carnival season is like a kind of technology of heating up to create, a certain atmosphere, and then after Carnival is like a cooling down. And then I was thinking about bush medicine and how bush medicine, a lot of bush medicine is conceived of as a cooling. And so I was wondering about these kinds of technologies of heating up and cooling down from the Caribbean, and how they could, articulate with climate crisis. And I just had this, connection when you're talking about climate crisis being relational and felt that the father of the family I live with in South Trinidad, he basically like compared violent crime and global warming as both manifestations of rage, in the sense that heat, like if one's head is hot, one's angry. So he, said youths are getting disrespected in this country, and so they're, angry. And he says the earth itself is angry, and that manifests as like intense heat. And so I was thinking about how that idea of could like lead to a relational, kind of, to climate change, rather than just, inviting the US to, bomb, off the coast of Trinidad to like, stop crime or whatever.
Let's take two more questions before. Let's take two more questions before we. There's one there.
Thank you. Good morning and congratulations. I'm really happy to see this panel. Really enjoyed these really thought-provoking, deep conversations that come out of this research project and those who we invited. I have a question with regard to the spaces where we produce knowledge, where we produce relationships, where we define things that could even influence policy. We talked about the Panyard, we talked about the Carnival Village, we talked about fetes, different establishments, and having had the experience of a churchgoer, as many people in the Caribbean do, even though I'm not about that life anymore.
You probably asked.
My question is, have we, and I talk specifically to the Caribbean people, have we purposefully avoided talking about the church? Because the church is such a space where you have poetics, where you have relations, where we have knowledge production. Why did we do that? I might have my own ideas about that, but I would really be interested to hear, especially my brother and sister who brought up in the Methodist tradition.
Oh, I'm still Catholic. Okay, there's one more question. There we go.
Thank you, everyone. Very, very profound presentations. I thought there was a bit of a contrast in the presentations, and I wanted to sort of draw a line there, in the sense that Catherine's conception of the inhuman, I wondered whether how does the inhuman, is that a process of transformation that happens? How does the inhuman become human? And I think in some respect, Catherine could have a conversation with the two other presentations, because I felt as though they dealt with the human and the creative and all the social and cultural formations that Korean people have instantiated in response to the racial capitalism. So I'm wondering if there could be sort of further elaboration on if there's a transformation process, and what is part of that, moving from the so-called slave or the so-called non-being, and how have people created places of being, right, on the first hand. Second presentation, I wanted any further comments or reflections on how people who participated in the harvest festivals, how they considered food and land. Because what I found in many sort of everyday people are not talking about climate change. What they're talking about living costs. they're talking about, their family struggles and so on and so on and so on. And so that's how it might manifest. And so there's a different conversation and language. Charisse, you go, girl. 100%. I'm really, really glad that in this space you made a point to call out sort of coloniality of academic research, and also the ways in which we further those forms of coloniality. So really, really congratulations to you. I think it was a very, very good presentation. And that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. So those are 3 questions. Let's give the panelists an opportunity to answer the 3 questions. I think it's not 2. I think it's 3, because I think Gregory's notion of the human is different than human as praxis, and the question of the inhuman. But Gregory first, because he had a specific question about language, I think, what people speak. Yeah.
All right. Thanks for the remark and the question. Indeed, like I mentioned in the presentation, upon let's say at the beginning of the research, you have these notions, and most of the literature also shows when you look for literature regarding, let's say, climate change and harvest festivals or and so forth, you see a specific type of literature appear, and when it specifically comes to the Caribbean and so forth, like you mentioned, the language specifically as presented in that way, it's only done you only hear that by, let's say, the academic class and researchers and so forth. So then you'll have to look for other ways of looking into how people make sense of their lives and how they tackle this issue. So prior to doing the research on harvest festivals, I also did research on soca music, soca and tumba, which is the local music of Curaçao and Bonaire and Aruba as well, and the soca. And what you notice also is that this definitely comes into play. So, for example, after a hurricane hit when it was in the 2000s in St. Maarten, what was that? 2017. We're talking about Lisanne, maybe you can help me. This is Luis.
1999.
99, and
95.
the New Rolling Stones came up with a song called "Who Loot" in response to looting that took place after the hurricane, and basically in the song they're dealing with these topics, but they're not mentioning climate change, the warming of the earth, increase or the severity of hurricanes. So, but they're describing ethnographically what is taking place. It's a documentation. So I think just to go back to what you're saying, I think of course we need to do more research about it, but it's just different ways of dealing with a topic, different language, different forms. And I think if we look into that, I think especially the arts, and that goes back to what Charissa presented, I think we can find a lot of interesting stuff. It's under research actually.
Charissa, do you want to? And then Katrin, I'll give you, and then we'll open it up again.
I'll try to do my best. In terms of the heating up and cooling down, I think I think it's part of our being, because right after Carnival is Lent. However, is Lent really observed in the way that it used to be observed? Because I think the party continues inside of there. Thereafter, there's Easter, and our lovely colleague, Shareli Manuelson, who unfortunately can't be with us, was looking at that, and Campamento and all the gathering that, that entails. After Easter, we quickly moving on to, I know there's like Christmas in July because people like that and they can't wait. And then it moves right steadily, quickly into, so there is this kind of festivalization of life, that we move from, one thing to the next to the next. And, I'm not sure if we can think about it in terms of heating up and cooling down. But there is this kind of ceremonious way of being that, even though, as you say, the earth is angry, I'm not sure I adhere to that, especially since, there's just these spaces of replenishing and reinvention, that speaks otherwise to that. I think that people are creating ceremonies in different ways. So I don't know if that answers your question or touches on it, but I think that's how I would enter that discussion. Yeah.
Broke out.
Um, I have not attended to the churchyard as such in a serious ethnographic way, but I think that it deserves attention as one of those spaces where, ceremony is also held and being is reorganized in different ways, and the ways that that is done needs to be untangled. I have not done that work, right? But I think it's part of all the other yards that we have, right? The Hoffy, the Panya, the Gael, it's the Batey. I think it's part of all of our creative spaces and meeting points. Um, someone
I
else.
don't know if I could just
Yeah.
chime in. So just to go back to the question of Antonio as well. I don't know. Maybe perhaps it has to do with the idea of separating the two spaces. And it's funny actually because, for example, even the fact that you play a steel pan in the church was always questioned. And of course, you're sitting next to a person that actually used to do that, and that was actually challenging the norm already. So actually, thank you for the question, Antonio, because it really actually puts us to think really that um, in this idea of only this separate space. So usually we would think, and this is actually what is even spoken about or preached as well, is that this is the devil, or this is not godly, or you don't mix the two. While yeah, it's
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, my pan teacher was an Anglican father, right, who introduced me to Sparrow and would quote Sparrow on the pulpit. So, these things are not separate, as Gregory is pointing out. Also, the Methodist Church has a Harvest Sunday,
yeah,
right,
this
where
this weekend.
it's this weekend. Oh, Maya missing that. Um, my mom is the organizer of the harvest, Sunday in church, right? So these things are multiple, and what I'm trying to get at is that we should think about them in terms of their multiplicity and not, compartmentalize or, hierarchize
And,
the knowledge practices that exist,
Mhm.
spaces and these practices.
Exactly. And just to add that the Harvest Festival, um, of the harvest in church, guess what? They also buy the fruits and the stuff in the supermarket and they bring it to church. So they don't even get it from the yard anymore. Just wanted to add that.
Then
Catherine?
also, if I'm not wrong, they're shared after. So, there's just so much of our practices that we really do need to attend to for what resides in them and how they are epistemological in that sense of they gave us an outline, they gave us a blueprint. And if we ignore that blueprint, we're doing ourselves a disservice.
Indeed.
The inhuman, or what is it to become is there a possibility of switching to the human?
I think
Or should we just forget about the human?
I can't quite remember. I guess, I mean, but again, I think maybe the human and human question kind of comes back to that multivalency again. That it's like, Sylvia Winter, I think maybe it's David Scott talks about her embattled humanism. It's like, and all the sort of revolutionary poets, they're working with human. You still got to work within the categories as while you're building something outside of them, because those are the categories that also organize your life and organize. So my kind of move to the inhuman is to just sort of recenter and decenter the human in order to think about kind of what is the sort of geophysics of that being, what is the kind of the environments that allow that to come into being. And part of that is to get away from a kind of colonial genealogy, the ways in which subjects have to articulate themselves in particular modes of kind of attesting to who they are and what, and the way in which these sort of epistemologies of knowledge expect certain kinds of like declarations around vulnerability in order to be incorporated into funding regimes, to think about kind of, so there's a sort of, we want to get rid of all the categorizations. We want to get rid of the apartheids of meaning and kind of like value, but at the same time, we also have to organize within them and kind of live within those. So I think that maybe what that sort of, I think Carissa had a really fantastic phrase about the kind of education of feeling. It's to put resource into the education of feeling outside of those structures, but also kind of become tacticians within those structures. If you go to a climate conference, like a sort of heads of state conference, these categories are very hard and fast, and they kind of so I want to abandon the human as a kind of as a historic legacy, but I also think that these things coexist in a sense in their density and in their kind of but the human always has this assimilatory kind of if you have to bring native law into Western law, essentially. So there's this kind of accumulation in humanism that always kind of is drawing into a predefined center. So maybe the inhuman allows us a kind of a little more kind of vicissitude in terms of how we relate to other beings and the earth.
May I say one thing, and then we'll get a 3-round again. In relation to your question, Keston, because your question was a question of, so how do they speak? And I think Gregory can talk about his ethnography. I'll give you an example. I was following persons who work in hotels, who I spoke about in relation to climate. But what I had to understand was, for them, the possibility of eating an apple to give to their children was virtually impossible. For months, they would have to save to actually be able to buy a pack of apples so that and that was like a great treat. So understanding that meant that the climate challenge is also the challenge of poverty. How do you make it possible for people to live a dignified life? That is also part of it, because of course these things are coming in, they're being flown in. But how are they being distributed, and how much do people have to be able to actually make a life? That is where climate is. It's not only in the buildings and in it's those small things that are of consequence. But it is also of consequence, I think, if you take into consideration that on many of these islands, oftentimes you have a lot of people that came from elsewhere, newcomers. St. Maarten, it's 80%. Aruba, it's now becoming 50% again. Those persons don't have a relationship to land the way much of this literature speaks about land. So their notion of how to deal with life will work necessarily differently. The last thing, and then I'm going to be quiet. The last thing, you're going to come. I'm going to get you right. Don't worry, I'm coming to you. The last one is the question of the human. One of the things I recognize being on Bonaire and on St. Maarten is that there is a thought beyond the human. It's not articulated sufficiently, but it's the question of who do you care for after a disaster happens? And then you realize people care for their cats and dogs. They share food with their cat. That is family. So it's a particular notion of kinship that is beyond the regular human cutoff point. When I ask Bonaireans, what would you want to be? Not human, not a dog, but a cat. And then you have to understand that philosophy, because a cat doesn't have a boss, and they have a history of being bossed around. So there are other things there that I think we need to take into consideration. Now I'll be quiet, and we'll take the three questions. Question. One there, one there. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I want to make some comment and a question to Richard. Have you, in your investigation, been on the topic of what is used and was used by our ancestors, what is called the griot, the historian that uses history, poetry, music, and so on for telling the story of the public that he is within, and in what relationship you can put that with is still practiced here in Curaçao, with is the tumba, where they say you better behave during the day during the year, or else they will sing about you at the end of the year. And the other question about how do you place what we call cantica di trabajo into dealing with climate and the environment of labor?
Nice. There was a question there. Aruba.
No, I just thought it was interesting, the example actually that you mentioned about it's a treat to get an apple. And that for me says a lot. Because on these Caribbean islands, how many apple trees do we see? Besides the apple dam on Aruba, I don't think an apple grows naturally here. It needs frost, which is one of the things we won't see in the Caribbean. So that concept on its own already, that an apple is a treat, for me, we are lost. I
That's
mean,
fascinating.
it should be a mango.
Okay. We're going indigenous again.
Yeah, so I guess it ties into both of the questions, but a bit maybe
Yeah.
a bit differently. So I'm definitely from the camp of Bosnandikaya, of Papiadikaya, in the sense that I do hold also kind of like a critical tone to celebration without change. So celebration and resilience organization of ourselves without actual systemic change. So I wonder if I can hear a bit more about that. So 5% or less than 5% of our food is locally grown, but we have the sehu, which is great. But and we celebrated this harvest festival with a lot of love and compassion and memory work, and we remember also the hard work that we put into it. But where is the systemic change in that? Where is systemic change? So that's what I wonder. And I really also, I would like to hear it from both Sharissa and Gregory, because Sharissa, you're mentioning this blueprint and giving texture to different kinds of epistemologies. But I wonder, how can we bring this texture that you're figuring out and understanding through the actions of people into actual systemic change? Okay, so the question is about systemic change.
Okay. And these were three questions. So who wants to start?
Thank you for the question. So when it comes to the griot, definitely that is actually the main vehicle for actually transmitting the information from village to village, generation to generation, from beyond the Middle Passage to our region. So when you look at the tumba, when you look at the calypso, when you look at the tambu, and all the other um, musical expressions, definitely the griot is it's extremely important in that process, and definitely also within the context of the harvest festivals as well. You also had a question regarding the work songs. Well, I think I would need to do more research on the work songs, but what you notice though, and in most of them, they are very much tied to themes of the environment. So agradecimiento pa, so being thankful for rain, for blessings. They always talk about secura and drought and so forth, and looking up to the heavens for rain to replenish the earth and so forth. So it's definitely embedded in the songs, in the work songs, as far as what I've studied at least. But I'm assuming that there is definitely more to be researched. So I don't know if I'm if I answered your question, or are you looking at something particularly different?
He wants the mic again. He wants to explain.
What you just commented on are things like Sehu and Simadan that talk about giving thanks. What I was questioning about is really the songs that are sung during labor, that they have an arithmetic where the labor is enforced
Yeah.
with the rhythm of the song. That's what I meant.
Yeah, those are not.
Okay, I would say that that definitely
It's good. It's good. Yeah, true. Sharissa? Oh, you want to? Yeah.
To answer that question, sorry, what your name, please? Yes, to answer Juan Carlos's question, by piggybacking on Gregory, the question I have in return is who is listening to the griot, right? Because the griots are speaking, right? But who's listening? So if I take something like the Dutch Caribbean Research Week, where I presented where I present a couple of times. I mean, how many people are interrogating Dutch Caribbean art practice through those frames? Not many, barely any. At the beginning of this project, folks couldn't even conceptualize that you can think about climate, weathering, you know, hurricanes through music, right? Because it's the way that we approach art in certain spaces within the Dutch Caribbean that there's no infrastructure. It reminds me of the question that Spivak asks, can the subaltern speak? Yes, they can speak, but they are not heard so that the speech act cannot be completed, right? So I think that's how I'm answering your question, and that's how I'm approaching my work to bring attention to it, right? A lot of times when we're talking about, culture um within the six islands, it's cultural industries, right? And it's trying to tack it onto, tourism in a certain kind of way because it leads back to economics. It's never the interrogation of the human as such, right? So people are practicing, but systemic change can only happen if they're being felt and if they're being heard, right? And if the joy that is being made is actually attended to in a very serious and concerted way. So, and that's not happening as yet.
and just to add,
I mean, I think precious work. I work with you. I read back with this. So it's more of me trying to think beyond. Okay, so now that see this, now that this blind spot as a spotlight, where do we need the voices? Which ears need to hear this, and how do we see this?
Education.
Sorry, Charissa, could you repeat the question? Live stream?
Oh, sorry. How? So after you've shown a light on, let's call it the problem, um, uh, how do we transgress that, in a sense, to build infrastructures further?
Yeah, so the question really goes back to the jump up and jump and wave. How do we how do how is that translated into action, right? How does that bring about change? That's the question, right? Because just before you answer, even in in that space, going back to the Greer and so forth, even when we talk about música de carnaval or calypso, soca, let's say popular music of the people. For example, in the calypso, what would be traditionally the griot. How many people go to just to refer to your question, how many people actually go to these festivals and so forth? And that would be in a traditional way. Someone is actually via double entente, presenting, shedding light on the ills of society and so forth. But what we noticed, what we discovered is actually via, and this goes back to what Charissa was presenting, it's actually via the jump up, via the jump and wave. Going back to the climate change, for example, we would never talk about it while, for example, an NBO would sing a song where actually people in unison, hundreds of people on the street in the Jambak Soca would say, raindrops falling on my head form a roof. And when you're talking about a storm that actually came or passed near the ABC Islands, run. You better run. Hold up. So people dancing and they're doing dances, but actually we're tackling actually these topics. But then still in the answer, because how do we bring it into action?
Charissa, and then I'll give you a chance to answer, and then
I mean, I'm gonna be simple. Education is one of the things, right? We have faculties of arts and science don't attend to art at the university level. We have humanities programs.
Why is that? Like, so the systems that you are identifying, they're actually also part of. Sorry, I'm screaming up.
So I'll scream a bit less. So I'm just motivated by your presentations and that it activates me in a certain way. But what I'm looking for is, so if we identify these blind spots, and I think one of the goals of Islanders at the Helm is also to provide insights into how to institutionalize certain forms of knowledge production that are contextualized in these localities. And then I wonder, can these griots, can the playing of the steel pan, can they become more part of the way we educate our kids? Because my kids go to school every day and they get a very a traditional way of education, which has been programmed since the Industrial Revolution. And then we're way back to point zero again, right? So how can these systems the textures that you are identifying, this blueprint of new or actually not new epistemologies, how can they become more integrated in these educational systems? So that's exactly where I'm heading, and that's what I'm interested in. How would you see the griot become a teacher? In what way would you see the steel pan become a way to inform the way everyday life is organized, for example? So this is what I'm looking for.
Charissa, then I'll give you.
I mean,
Never you. I mean, yeah, go.
in a sense, I'm not beholden to these institutions either, right? I mean, something have to happen outside of those institutions as well, right? So yes, education is a part of it, primary to tertiary, but the outside spaces that we have available to us, are we actually using them to their full potential? That's also part of it. Um, Policy. I don't want to step on my colleagues' territory, but territory. um, but our policy writers and policymakers, are they going into these spaces? Are they attending to it? We have a joint paper that is about to come out on that topic as well. So I think there's different intersections. I mean, we can talk further about it later.
Can I give Catherine the floor? We have a question. A question here, and then and then I'll close it. Can you close it? Yeah, go.
Yeah, so thank you all for the papers. And this is for Charisse, if I pronounced that correctly. I was really struck by a comment that you made. This is so disconcerting. A comment that you made about the importance. Like, okay, I'm not going to frame it as well as you did, but you said, part of what the work that you're doing, or the thinking that you're doing, is to think and to really try to, rather than the rush to we must speak in order to shape policy. The important thing is to speak and to sort of start to really articulate what it is that we are experiencing, how we think these things in relation to like a grammar through this long history of the Caribbean sport that contains many a long history of this conversation. So I wonder, I guess, questions, how do we make this policy? How do we? And I want to say more about precisely what that statement that you made. I was struck because I was thinking of like Audre Lorde, for example, and that comment, that to speak, knowing that we were never meant to survive. That maybe, maybe a little bit contrary to Spivak. The point is not necessarily, that the speech only matters when certain people hear it. The speech matters because it matters, right? And the space and the time to think these things through is actually really important. And I just wondered if you could say more about that.
I can try. This is slow work, right? And it takes a lot of time. And in the Dutch Caribbean specifically, I think art practice, creative art practice, cultural practice has always been sidelined. So I think for now, my job, the way I see it, is just to shed a light, right? Those who choose to take it up, then great. But I just really do want to shed a light on the importance of creative art practice for for the region. I don't know if that answers your question.
One little piece, and then we go to Catherine.
Many of these creative practices have been collective practices of resistance and have been born from that history of exploitation and oppression. And so the steel pan was born from that. Calypso was born from that. So all these things have been action-oriented. Even in our protests, many of our resistance efforts, there's the steel pan, there's singing, there's dancing. You see a protest in Trinidad. People are whining and dancing and moving all over the place. So we have always integrated and incorporated these creative practices in our protests and in action. I think that, may I say one thing? The point I think that I interpret what you were saying is that it's not necessarily institutional recognition that might bring about the kind of change or action, because a lot of that is going on informally outside of an institution needs to happen in order for
politicians and so on to be pushed, right, and for them to be influenced in one way or the other. So I think not necessarily bringing it into institutions that would create the kind of impetus for change, but it's also recognizing even ourselves in this room, recognizing that those creative practices and those artistic practices are part of our history of protest and action, right? And part of how we might recognition within ourselves of those practices can actually help us build the momentum for the kind of collective action that might bring about.
We are almost going over time. Yeah, we are almost going over time. So I'm going to now give each of the presenters an opportunity to elaborate, say whatever you would like to say on all the questions you were fielded, and then we will begin to close the session. I had something to say, but I think I should let everyone speak. Yeah. Gregory is fine?
Yeah, I just want to just thank everyone for their questions, their remarks, and so for the feedback. And I think it's food for thought for us to continue doing work. As you say, what do you call it, Sharisa? It's the type of work it is, long, slow work. Yeah, I like that word.
Catherine, would you like to?
I mean, just a quick reflection on the sort of idea about bringing. Can you hear? Oh, the sort of desire to bring into like the poetic into kind of permanent social marks in kind of policy spaces and so on. And I think that we've had some amazing demonstrations today about the question of temporality. It's like the future is always mapped as this kind of open, like vacuous space, but like the temporalities of these forms of resistance and organizing and gathering and collecting have, their duration is, extraordinary. And I think that they get complete that durational capacity to gather and then to create space and times that interrupt the colonial clock kind of what to pay attention to, because they also tell us something about how the future comes into being.
Thank you. Sharissa?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. That's all I have to say.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me thank everyone for coming out today. This work package, I think, was interesting because it started to break down a 19th century inheritance that's also a Caribbean inheritance. The 19th century inheritance was when the sciences were coming about. They needed to not be religion, not be the arts, and not be mysticism. That's how they came about. When they said, nowadays, we need to bring in a little bit of arts, they wanted to remain what they were. If you bring arts into sciences, sciences cannot remain what they were. If you bring religion into science conversation, science cannot be the same, and mysticism cannot be the same either. I think that's what this was about. Let me just mention, because I do have to mention it, that Yvette Rusibisa is a researcher here who took the question of religiosity seriously, and she is going to be presenting as well. We're going to have lunch, and after lunch we'll have Hatip. Where's Hatip? I'm looking for you. Hatip, who will be thinking Caribbean thought in relation to West Papua. We're going to have Harjes Kouar. Where are you, Harjes? Stand up so people can see you. Stand up. Yeah, Harjes will also be talking about Saba and its lace work. Arginia Lucio is not in here. And Micaela Ribeiro. There we go. Yeah, who will also be speaking about the water archives. Yeah, so let's have a break, eat, and then we continue in the... Oh yeah, and we also have the workshop. Sorry. Betsy Girigori, I'm not seeing her yet. Yeah, she's going to be giving a workshop as well on early warning systems, which we also participated in Islanders to make it possible. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, there is lunch in the restaurant. We have vegetarian options and standard options. If you do not have a coupon yet, you can come to me.
Are these the coupons? Yeah, I think so.